Hey everybody, welcome back to Pomerium Live. I'm your host Nick Taylor, and today I'm hanging out with my buddy Den Delimarsky. Den, how you doing today?
Hello, hello. I like that Hollywood intro. I'm feeling like I'm in the cinema. It is fantastic.
In a world where no, I don't know. I definitely don't have that voice for that, but anyway, yeah, no, awesome to have you on. We caught up recently at the MCP Dev Summit in San Francisco, which was awesome to just see some old friends and some new people. But before we kind of dig into MCPs, people kind of always like to know like how did somebody get into tech, and we definitely don't have to do like your whole like documentary, but curious what brought you to tech.
Yeah,
Was it like I came out of the womb and I was with a keyboard, or was it
basically. Yeah,
yeah.
there you go. That's the story. No, hey everyone. I am Den Delimarsky. I am a product engineer at Microsoft. So I work in our core AI division. So I'm contributing to AI incubation and the fun stuff that happens with GitHub Copilot and all the tools around that. Um, but I'm also a model context protocol core maintainer, and I work closely with the community to make sure that we're shaping the protocol in a way that helps it grow and get more adoption. To your question of like where did I start in technology? Boy, that's a long story. But I'll give you the gist of it. It's like it all started with the fact that I kind of always loved computers. I love computers
Okay.
because it's very easy. Not easy is overly trivializing it. Like computers enabled me to do things that I ordinarily couldn't because like maybe I'm not good at woodworking and building things with my hands, but with computers I could just code things up. And I remember just getting kind of the excitement from the first Visual Basic 6 book that I had. You can build these interfaces and click on buttons and things would just happen, and I was like,
Okay.
wow, this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
amazing, right? So that hooked me. Like from that point on, I knew that this is what I want to do, right?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
since then, it just kind of organically grew. Like I'm a developer at heart. I've been building software for the past like 2 decades or more, and
Yeah.
it's been just a joy. It's just a joy to dive into a lot of these technological aspects, figure things out. It's like a puzzle they have to solve, and then throw it into the world and see that other people will use it too, and they'll find it useful. And yeah,
Mhm.
so I do a bunch of this stuff. Like I reverse engineer things, I document APIs, and in this new era of AI that we're kind of thrust into, I
Yeah.
am working on trying to make software more useful for developers.
No, that's super cool, and glad you brought up VB6. I did some Visual Basic 6 was some of my first real world work
Yeah.
in terms of job. It was actually funny. The job was it was an actual basic program that ran in DOS. It was for accounting and like inventory for construction. And so
Yeah.
the first migration was like literal DOS basic to VB6, and then later on it was VB.net. I'm more of a fan of C sharp, but
Oh, yeah.
the
There you go.
migration path made sense at
Yeah.
that time. But that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
and
and that's funny because like for a lot of people, when they think about their first steps with computers, it's usually like, oh, sure, like I built this like website and the marquee was the thing. Here's the
yeah,
fun fact. Where I grew up, I did not have internet. Like the internet was like
okay,
super expensive, super inaccessible because that's what you get for not growing up in America. And that naturally, so the thing I could only do is do local development, which VB6 was the thing. It's like, oh, I can do
yeah.
this here with a book, and I don't have internet. Like I can't build a website or GeoCities or whatever else it would be. But yeah, that's where it started.
Yeah, it's making me laugh because not your experience, but I remember this was before I really understood programming, and I would load up some program. This was either on Windows 95, maybe even Windows
Oh yeah,
3.11,
yeah.
and it would say missing DLL,
Mhm.
and so me thinking I'm super smart, I'm just like I'm gonna create some file and just call it that, and maybe it'll work. And then you know,
Yeah.
obviously that did not fix it,
No, it did not. No,
yeah, yeah.
no way,
I
man.
was I was so disappointed. I was like, "Why does this empty file not fix this?" But
Yeah.
anyways,
Yeah. And I see that Hassan in the chat is saying ancient. And I was like, yeah. Okay. That's
yeah,
accurate.
yeah, we might break our hips on this live stream,
Yeah.
Hassan.
That's
So
okay.
that's why you got two. Uh, anyway, so yeah, so like obviously you've been in the industry for a while, and like you said, you've been digging into MCPs, model context protocol. I'll drop a link to that because it to kind of bring up model context protocol MCPs. It's like it is still pretty fresh. Like I
Yeah.
literally. I think I might have heard about it. It came out last November. I think like end of November last year. And then I ended up going to the MCP Dev Summit because I happened to see Angie Jones post because
Mhm.
we're friends, and I just saw her post, and I was like, oh, what's this? And then a few days later I said work. We should probably go to this. And then it's like,
Yeah.
and then from there it's like, I mean, it was already like a fast moving train, but it's like even over the past couple months since the MCP Dev Summit, like things are just flying. It's getting adopted, and it's honestly kind of mind-boggling given how immature is not the word. I would say young. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's still stuff going on it, but it's like I can't think of anything recently that got as much traction this quickly for how young a project
Yeah.
or protocol it is.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a bunch of different factors. Like the stars just aligned at the right place at the right time, and for that is because it all coincided with kind of the emergence of LLM. So I'll caveat
Yeah.
this by saying that what I'm talking about is a reflection of my opinion as Den. Like it does not
Yeah.
stand for any company or any organization, but the idea is that when LLMs came out, right? Like people got excited about LLMs as a whole. Like we saw Chat GPT pop up, and like all of this was
Yeah.
really cool because things like, wow, like, you can actually like interact with this LLM. But then the questions started coming in from a lot of folks in more kind of serious scenarios where you talk about
Mhm.
enterprises, you talk about developer scenarios. Like, well, how can you make this useful for me, right? Like because it's not just about a chat bot where you can come in and go back
Yeah.
and forth and just like answer me some questions, right? Like that's not kind of the thing
Yeah.
that excites a lot of people. It's more about the actual utility. And here's the thing: when it comes to LLMs and utility within organizations, within even hobbyists, student communities, it's all about like. But here's the thing: when you train an LLM, the data
Yeah.
set that you train it on is fairly limited, and it's of course it's trains on the corpus of the content on the whole internet, but
Yeah.
like it's a snapshot in time. It's a snapshot in time that is kind of locked in with the model release, and then you go in and then you hope that model does what you want. But the problem is
Yeah.
we live in a world of APIs. We live in a world of all sorts of data stores, databases, applications, right? And for a lot of those, how do you have LLMs interact with them and extract the data or even provide the data and then kind of drive some of these things without retraining the
Mhm.
model, without constantly going through this loop of like, let me go in and then do this expensive
Yeah.
compute operation, right? So the folks at Anthropic, David Sarayapara, like and a bunch of other folks have created this concept. It's called model context protocol. And the easiest way to explain this, I learned this from my good friend James Montemagno at Microsoft, but basically like flip the words. It's a
Okay.
protocol to provide context to models. That's what MCP is. It basically is a pipe for you to be able to connect the power of LLMs with any other sources of data or applications, right? Like we see some really, really cool application of MCP where you
Yeah.
have LLMs driving tools like Blender, right, for 3D modeling, which is freaking
Yeah.
amazing. Like you have MCP for reverse engineering tools like Gidra from NSA, that you can actually use the MCP connected to a LLM to go and operate this as if you're having the LLM complete a task. You can say like, I want to
Yeah.
design a scene in Blender that has 3 dragons and this, like isometric walls, and then do this, and then it goes because the MCP server. And by the way, the concept of the MCP server, people have this like, why is it a server? It's like
Yeah.
think of it as just like an MCP server is essentially the entity that you can channel data through from the LLM and to the LLM, right? Like the concept
Yeah.
of the server is just called a server. But you can have a server that exposes a number of primitives, and those primitives can be tools, they can be resources, they can be routes. Like you can read more in the docs. I'm not going to go too deep into every one of them, but the gist
Yeah.
of it is one of the most common things the server exposes are tools, right? And tools basically says my server can do X, Y, and Z. So if my server is for Blender, I can
Hmm.
create a scene, I can create a cube, I can create a sphere, whatever, right? And
Yeah.
so when you connect it to an LLM or an MCP client that exposes an LLM, you have essentially the ability of the LLM, and this is a loaded word reason because it doesn't really reason per se, but it can essentially, when you
Yeah.
give it a task, it breaks it down into chunks. Say, oh, you want a scene with dragons? I need to go in and first set up a room. And then it goes and says like, hey, MCP server for Blender. Oh, you have a tool that says like set up scene. Let me invoke that. And then you go and you do all these things, right? And the same is applied like to any other scenarios. You can have MCP servers for data stores. You can have MCP servers for, your Dropbox account and connect to your Gmail, and all these kind of things that you
Yeah.
could do to basically give an LLM dynamic context and the ability to dynamically interact with the world around it.
Yeah, it's definitely cool just seeing the explosion of the ecosystem. I think that's really what's driving it. Like this kind of reminds me of like a little long in the tooth here, but like there's V for anybody that's ever used a VCR, there used to be Betamax and there was
Yeah.
VHS. VHS ended up winning out. Maybe Betamax was, I think, technically better, but I don't think the ecosystem ever just caught on. And it's not like VHS was terrible, anyways. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying this in reference to MCP not being good. That's what I mean. It's just more like it got that ecosystem and it just took off, like, and it feels like that's what's happening because there's obviously other protocols out there, and it's not to say the other ones
Yeah.
won't, evolve as well or get ecosystem, but it's like literally anywhere you go, if like in my Twitter bubble, on Blue Sky, wherever, it's MCPs all day, and I'm here
Yeah.
for it.
I think it's this sort of like, we're not in the business of making predictions. Like I don't have a crystal ball and tell you that in 5
Yeah, yeah,
years this is what we're gonna live in. But we just see this huge, huge, huge uptake in MCP adoption, right? Like we see big
yeah.
companies. Like I work at Microsoft. We are using MCP for like so many things. Like VS Code
Yeah,
has launched support for full MCP, just went full spec support recently.
yeah.
It has support for like all the modern capabilities of MCP, right? Like there is that weight of the community, and there's that very clear need of
Mhm.
MCP is the thing for us. It solves the problem we want to do. How do we do this? And that
Yeah,
community weight actually drives a lot of these decisions and investments. Is because there's people behind it. There's very real scenarios that we want to
yeah,
implement and we want to highlight. And that's what makes it kind of that protocol today, right? Like it's hard to say that like in 15 years, is it still going to be MCP? Like, I don't know, like hard to
yeah,
tell. But for now, the community is here, the scenarios are here, the capabilities are here, and there's very, very active development and involved from the industry as a whole. We see
yeah.
companies, we see communities, we see individual developers investing in this, so which is always great to see.
Yeah, totally. And the thing is, so you're saying there's tools in there, and like we already have tools. So like I know, like for example, if we talk about like VS Code has built-in tools that you can use in Copilot. They're
Hmm.
not necessarily MCP servers. I know where I
Hmm.
used to work, open source. We had like a AI offering, and we would do tool calling just in our
Yeah,
LLMs and stuff. But I, so like we've had tools for a while, but I think the thing that's interesting with MCP is, at least in the context of remote ones, is it's kind of like a group of similar tools or associated tools that don't necessarily have to be stuck like where I used to work. We would have had to use them only where we had built it,
yeah,
or like, or maybe there's local ones too, obviously, but like I think the cool thing about the remote ones is it's like, oh, hey, you want to use my tools? Here you go. It's kind of like, hey, you want some of my Legos? Here you go.
yeah,
And I think that's what's interesting too, and just seeing how people are putting them together too. To your point about context, like, because like, like the way I see it is, you're definitely getting context for LLMs for things like we typically, like when I demo some of our stuff, we have like a Northwind database, which I'm sure
Mhm.
you're aware of.
Yeah.
So we use
Yeah.
that as a MCP server to say to get our real air quotes sales data as part of the context, and but at the same time you could use it for something else to just say like, like Kent talked about this his Jarvis talk at the MCP Dev Summit, but just like book me a flight. It's giving context somewhere else probably, but then it's just coming back to you to say, hey, I booked it for
Yeah.
you. So it's like
Yeah.
lots of use
For sure.
cases.
And this is where, like, again, we have a question in the chat here, is like, can you reflect upon how the MCP is aware of the context? And the thing is, like, when you look at the actual, like, the beauty of LLMs, and that is
Yeah,
they're very good at understanding. And again, I use understanding in quotes because, like, we're talking about a
yeah, yeah,
program here. It's at the end of the day, it's like bits and bytes at
yeah,
understanding natural language, right? So when you give it a natural query of saying, to Kent's example of like, book me a flight, right?
yeah,
It understands, like, okay, so the user is looking at booking a flight. Do I have any tools available to me that allow me to book a flight? And then if I have an
yeah,
MCP server connected, when you connect an MCP server, it exposes a set of those primitives that we talked about, right? Like, and in this case, you can have a tool that says book a flight. And
yeah,
this tool would have both a name and a description that essentially is the metadata for the LLM to say, look through all the tools and find the ones that allow me to book a
hmm,
flight. And it's like, oh, this tool here from this MCP server is likely the one that I need to book a flight
yeah,
because the description says so and this name says so. I'm going to go and use that. And this is
hmm,
where, like, you kick off that process and then you go from there, and then you feed into this loop of interacting with the LLM. It invokes
yeah.
tools based on the context, and then it continues through the action of whatever you're doing.
Yeah, no, totally. And since it's agentic too, like you could say go book that flight. That like we haven't really talked about MCP clients yet, but like
Mhm.
like the MCP server could be a client too, where it says, "Hey, I got to go and do some other stuff
Yeah.
too," and like and I think this is kind of a nice segue to kind of like talk about security a bit because like
Yeah.
you know at least the way I notice MCPs kind of evolve is like it came from devs initially. Like everybody's kind of running I kind of equate it to like when I used to do SharePoint dev where you're an admin on your Windows machine. But like that's kind of how people were, at least that's what I
Yeah.
perceive people using like the local MCP servers. Like, it's all good. It's my machine. Just let it do whatever. And I don't want to say that people didn't care about security, but I think to some degree, and this is just my opinion, but
Yeah.
I feel like people are like, it's fine. It's just on my local. But you know, when real world comes into play, like money or like booking a flight, just saying like, it's okay. I'm sure nobody will do anything bad. That's obviously security comes to the forefront and pretty
Yeah.
quickly. And that's what you do on the like. There's different. Are there different steering committees or is it just your security on the steering committee?
No, there is a basically a steering committee, like a group of core maintainers and maintainers, and
Okay.
which, by the way, we're formalizing this now. It's in the repo. It's in the model context protocol repo. Like, we're standardizing how
Okay.
these comms instructions and governance. And again, David Sarapar like published a governance doc that kind of outlines how this works for MCP. But yeah, there's just,
Okay.
yeah, think of it as just one committee with different people focused on different areas and different
Yeah.
groups of people. By the way, like there's like the maintainer groups. Like, we have a whole group for Auth with like folks like Aaron Parecki from Okta, which is awesome. So
Yeah.
there's a bunch of these.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And so like I know prior to the MCP Dev Summit, so this was like I think it might have been June 3rd.
Mhm.
I think OAuth came into the spec right around that time, or it was just it became official, I think.
Mhm.
And it talked about it at the MCP Dev Summit, obviously, and there was updates about the project. And like I guess like even before we start talking about security and MCP, maybe we could like go back
Yeah.
a step because like people are always intimidated by OAuth or
Yeah.
I'm generalizing, but I feel like it's a pretty big good generalization. But like even myself, it's like, it's like OAuth, you hear authorization, but like why are people logging in with it? You know what I mean? There's
Yeah.
confusion as well between, auth N, auth Z. So like I thought it'd be kind of good for just the audience in general. Like let's take a step back and like let's just talk about that
Yeah.
for a second.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe we even take a step further back and kind of outline that
Okay.
the MCP servers themselves can have two shapes, right? Like
Yeah.
you can have a local MCP server and you can have a remote MCP server. And this is where, like, again, people think that this is like scary new, but conceptually, a lot of these things have existed forever, right? Like
Yeah.
a local MCP server is a local application that you run on your box.
Yeah.
That's it. That's a local MCP server.
Yeah.
When you see people talk about like it's a local MCP server for Blender, that means you're installing some binary that is going to be talking to Blender.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the complexity is that in the application itself. But right, and
Yeah.
then remote MCP servers are nothing other than an API. It's a web
Mhm.
API. You're hosting a web API somewhere. You have a URL. You plug the URL into your client and say, "This is my remote server."
Yeah.
So in the before times, and this is like I'm saying like a few months back,
Yeah.
we had a spec for MCP and for a model
Yeah.
context protocol because it's a protocol. It has a specification. And the specification is essentially think of it as kind of the minimum bar. Like if you're
Mhm.
somebody that wants to implement an MCP server or an MCP client, you have to make sure that you follow the specification. For 99.9% of developers, you don't actually need to read the spec. Like just use an SDK. Like you don't need to go and
Yeah.
build everything from scratch. But the specification outlines how things are done and why they're done the way that they are. Right. So this is the spec is there. So the first version of the spec implied that you as a developer would have to go and implement your own what's known as the authorization server. So the MCP server that you would host, and specifically this is only applicable to remote MCP servers because
Yeah.
if you're running locally in the box, like you don't need really authorization against the
Yeah.
server because you have an application running there. Now, you might need authorization with like other services like GitHub or Dropbox or Salesforce or whatever you might be logging in, but you're not authorizing yourself to the server. You're authorizing yourself to
Yeah.
downstream APIs. Now, for remote servers, this becomes kind of important because if I have a remote server that allows me to manage my Gmail account, for example, right?
Mhm.
I can just give you a URL and say, Nick, can you just plug this in, log in with this with your Gmail
Yeah.
account? Right. Because then you're, well, hold on. Like, isn't the server shared by literally everyone? Like, how do you make
Yeah.
sure that like my credentials are associated with me? So the initial spec assumed that kind of you would be the one that builds these kind of relationships in your server. You would have, you would have logic to issue access tokens to the clients, which is very hard to do and very hard to get right. Like there's of course libraries, but it's just a lot of
Yeah.
complexity related to it. So we worked with the community to just kind of rehash this a little bit to improve it. And for that, we essentially split the responsibilities of the client and the MCP server. And for that, we
Mhm.
decided to say like, look, for the client, your client is responsible for just triggering the authorization process with the server. The server, in turn, is going to advertise a document. Think of it as like a JSON blob, basically, that says, "Hey,
Yeah.
by the way, like when you come to me and you try to log in, I'm using Okta or I'm using Entra ID or I'm using
Yeah.
Auth0 for authorization. Go to
Yeah.
them and get a token for me first." And then
Mhm.
come back to me and talk, and I'll give you the list of tools that I have and interact with, and give you the ability to interact with me. So
Yeah.
we reframe the spec to basically remove the burden from developers to go and implement this from scratch. Because the biggest problem with security, as you know, is that security is hard. And for
Yeah.
a lot of folks, especially in the industry that are not in the security space, people that want to build MCP servers for, I don't know, their accounting software or whatever else. Like they're like, look, man, like I have a scenario in mind. I want to
Yeah.
implement this scenario. I'm not a security expert. I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to accidentally like malform a token or not validate it
Yeah.
correctly and not. So the new specification allows you to use existing expertise, tooling, and services for authorization without you having to write this from scratch, which I think is a big win. And I think it's a
Yeah.
big benefit for the broader MCP community because like even if you're not a security expert, you can just use off-the-shelf tools to build secure MCP servers, which is to me
Yeah.
is key.
I definitely think going with off the shelf is a good idea. I can give you a real scenario that when I was I worked in the .NET ecosystem a lot, like I was mentioning SharePoint before, and at one point I acquired a custom SAML implementation
Hmm.
for at single sign-on, and basically the contractor that had done it said, yeah, it's pretty much ready, you can probably ship it next week. It did not ship next week, and once it finally went live, I was constantly fixing issues.
Yeah.
And basically, I don't know how much money they spent on me fixing the bugs all the time, but eventually I talked to one of my coworkers. I'm like, we should just get them a off the shelf,
Hmm.
single sign on solution. Did that, ran into one little issue going to prod, but like after that, it was like my screen keeps going off and it's making my camera go wonky. Um, but yeah, so we put it into prod, and after that, no issues again.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like,
It's look, man, this is one of those things where I am a big fan of leaving security to the security experts. The reason for that is because again, there's so much nuance to this. Think of it this way: like if you're building a identity provider or an authorization
yeah,
server, you have to think through many things like abuse vectors. Who is going to be getting this token? How are they requesting this token? What information gets baked in? Can they request a token with stolen credentials? What happens then?
yeah,
How do we revoke a token? There's just a myriad of problems that you would need to be tackling yourself, right? And
yeah.
if you implement this from scratch, the risk of you getting this wrong is immense. And that
Oh
means
yeah.
that the risk of the data is also immense because you just implemented something. You can't vibe code this. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I love the concept of like vibe coding and building things as a hobby and like churning this out, but like things like this is just not possible to do without very extensive expertise and understanding why you're doing and how you're doing security. And to me,
Yeah,
this means that you should use off the shelf products from people that actually spend 24/7 doing this, people that will respond to
yeah.
incidents, people that have audits and validation and controls in place, right? Is
Oh yeah,
just
for
like
sure.
it would be unreasonable to ask developers to every single MCP server implementer to go and say, before you build your MCP server for, listing your files, how about you learn, cryptography? And also like,
Yeah,
like who wants to do that? Like,
yeah, for sure. And not only that, it's like the goal of like, I want to build an MCP server is you want to provide some service or business value to somebody. And
exactly.
if you're in the weeds trying to implement something that you're not an expert in,
Bingo.
one, it seems like a waste of resources, to be honest. Like, I bet if you do the math, because like I've seen this happen before, people are like, why don't we just build it ourselves? Whatever it is, and then
Bingo. Yep.
it becomes this monster thing, and you're like, yeah, we probably should have just bought.
Yes, and I think this is what gets missed in a lot of these conversations is because when you have an idea for an MCP server, it doesn't have to be an MCP server. It can be any product, right?
Yeah,
You,
yeah,
you
exactly.
have a problem in mind that you have to solve. Your customer has a problem of they want quick access to their files. They want access to their, I don't know, weather data or bank transactions or whatever else. And
Yeah,
for those things, to what extent do you want to be focusing on this bike shedding and implementing little things that have already been implemented? And
yeah,
I know it is very easy as engineers to get very excited about this. Like, man, I can write a better library for this. It's going to be
yeah,
more,
yeah,
but like, but is your problem shipping that library? Or is your
yeah,
problem that your customers need access to their files? And you want to make sure that you give them access in a safe, secure way and then move
yeah,
on to other things. To me, I'm a fan of the latter. Like to me, I am a big
yeah.
problem solver. Like I don't really care about libraries in the sense that like I like building them. If I need to build
Hmm.
it, I will. But if it's something that I'm not familiar with and this is something that I need a lot of expertise in, where I'm just like, and I need to ship a product ahead of me, like I'll always
Yeah.
focus on taking it off the shelf, solve the problem, and then move on to the next.
Oh yeah, for sure. I guess the only one thing I would say there is definitely not discouraging people to learn things. Like, if you want to like
No,
understand
no,
how
of
it
course.
works deeply, go for it. But in a work context, maybe just
Exactly.
evaluate the pros and cons before you
Exactly. Yeah, like
Yeah.
look, I'm not a stranger to things like reverse engineering. I got very annoyed by the fact that like some of the tools that exist for some of the hardware that I use are just straight up annoying. They are. And so I was like,
Yeah.
I'm going to reverse engineer this. I'm going to figure this out and build my own. The tool
Yeah.
existed, right? Like it's there, but I want to build a better one, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But as you said, in a business context, when your outcome is solve a customer problem that exists, unless you
Yeah.
have a very, very good reason for re-implementing something from scratch, which is a
Yeah.
tendency for a lot of folks to do, look off the shelf first. And
Yeah.
unless like you very well might run into a library that you're doing. And by the way, when we talk even like about MCP security, right? The
Mhm.
specification outlines the minimum bar. The kind of this is the least common denominator for how authorization should be done. If you're running this in a business scenario where you're like, well, we're using a completely different auth flow because we have some internal services and we have internal auth, that's fine. Like build your own library if you need to. Like the spec doesn't say you can't. It's just the least
Yeah.
common denominator.
Yeah. It's a good segue for me to drop your blog post. Please don't write your own MCP authorization code. Good
Yeah,
timing. Zing.
good timing.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, and I guess to that point, like, uh, obviously people have been working on the security specs of this, and I'm gonna drop a link to your post over on LinkedIn too here. This is the one annoying thing with multi-streaming. Not all the platforms allow you to post
Yeah,
to. Anyways,
that's okay.
first world problems. First world problems. But there's obviously been some changes to the spec.
Mhm.
I guess maybe like obviously feel free to go give a read, folks. You can just go to modelcontextprotocol.io. But I guess from the first phase of putting OAuth in there, it was just like, here's guidelines. And then now there's been some new guidelines in regards to resources. And I can't remember if
Mhm.
that was the main thing or
Yeah, there's a few.
there's a lot in there. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to just maybe touch on that. Like we can definitely encourage people to go
yeah.
give it a read as well. But
Yeah, for sure. I'd say like, look, if you have time and desire, please go read the spec and tell us where we got it wrong, because I'm sure there's a lot of opinions with auth. I will say though that if you are looking at implementing authorization with MCP in your own project, use the
mhm,
SDKs. Use any of our SDKs. Like we have Python, there's TypeScript, there's Java, there is C Sharp. Like in C Sharp, we just launched the authorization spec just fairly recently, and
yeah,
you got to make sure that like if you are going to build this, use things like we said, like off the shelf, like they exist. Don't re-implement it from scratch. The spec is very dense. The spec has a lot of
yeah,
content that basically has to uh cover a lot of the ground that exists there, but all this is encoded in the SDKs themselves. And the new
yeah,
spec does a few things, right? Like I mentioned things like the protected resource metadata document, which allows you to expose information from the server as to what authorization server you're using. Are you using Entra, Okta, any other service? We
yeah,
also support things like the resource parameter to make sure that we prevent token misuse, and that is basically making sure that when the client, the MCP client, is requesting a token from an authorization server, it says, "Oh, and by the way, this token is from mcp.den.dev." Like, are you sure you want to give it to that resource? Because you
yeah,
know, what if I go to Gmail and I say, "Hey, Google, give me a token." But by the way, the resource that's asking this token is mcp.den.dev. Then their authorization server can say, hold on a second. Like, why is Den requesting a Gmail token? Why would I issue that? So
yeah.
these important guardrails are there in the spec, and they're baked into the SDKs themselves as well. Like we're working on making sure that it's fully compliant. And it just simplifies your life. It just simplifies your life as a developer to use the SDKs instead of just re-implementing the spec from scratch, because the SDKs themselves are spec compliant.
Okay, yeah, yeah. No, for sure. And so I think like I've read through it, but it is it's a bit to sink in. But
Yeah.
it sounds like the main thing is it's putting some kind of guardrails on in terms of just make sure you're authorizing the correct resource and so on. And I know it, touching on like you obviously work at Microsoft. There's like you have a notion of a Gateway, I believe. I saw
We
that
do.
with
Yeah.
you. Yeah, I saw your talk at the AI World Fair, and I, I'm I'm curious because like reading through the spec, like full disclosure, I work at Pavarium obviously, and like we're working on a gateway too, and
Yeah.
we think it's a great way, and like there's discussions about that. Uh, and I'm referencing it also because you obviously you mentioned my blog post I wrote a little while
Mhm.
ago, and I'm just curious on your general thoughts on all that. And this is meant to be 100%
Yeah.
constructive and
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you're getting to something that's very important, and this is actually, by the way, like, completely company agnostic. Like, we know that like
yeah.
gateways are not a Microsoft concept. This is not a startup concept. Like, people have been building gateways for years. It's a
Hmm.
nice abstraction in the world of MCP because you can basically put a gateway in front of your compute. And when I
Yeah.
say compute, think of it like if you write a remote MCP server. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's a web API. You're going to host it somewhere in the cloud. So when you host it somewhere in the cloud, that means that you have to now go and figure out, well, how do you do things like your MCP server receives a token, right? That says,
Hmm.
I am Den and I claim to be Den and this is my token and all the expiration information. Like, are you going to implement it from scratch to validate it? Like, maybe, right? But
Yeah.
like, you would still be taking on a lot of this complexity of implementing this auth logic because you kind of have to if you want to make sure that your server is secure. Now,
Yeah.
gateways abstract that out and they basically package up a lot of these concepts where you can say, oh, for your MCP server, how about you just throw it into the compute resource, whatever it is, whether it's Azure Functions, AWS Lambdas, doesn't really matter. And then in
Yeah.
front of it, you put a gateway. So the gateway then is responsible for things like the protected resource metadata document. Then it's responsible for accepting tokens, validating the tokens, and then passing them in. The gateway can be responsible for caching tokens and making sure that they are stored server side. So whenever you request like another, give me the ability to interact with another tool, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
the server says, oh, hold on, like, is this token valid? Oh, do I have this in the cache? Yes. Like, you don't
Yeah.
need to implement all this from scratch. So gateways are extremely useful. I think I've seen them pop up like several times on my even like my LinkedIn feed where I see people like launching like an MCP auth gateway and like that. It's a
Yeah.
thing, and I think there's a very very strong developer need for that because again, nobody wants to do auth when auth is not their primary business.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And to be clear, I think this complements what's like. Well, from what I've read, like I'll be honest, I'm somewhat new to the security space. I did work at McAfee at one point,
Mhm.
but like this is like I started here in January, so like I've been just reading a lot and like going through the spec, and even the spec, it doesn't dictate what you should do with the gateway. It just says there should be one there, and
Yeah,
so there's definitely some good nuggets. I'm gonna drop a link to the best practices there for people to check out. Um, but
that's a good doc, by the way. The security best
yeah,
practices. This is something that it's outside the spec because it's not the spec per se, but it also
yeah,
lists a number of attack vectors that we predict would happen, and we see it kind of like emerging as a potential problem. So I
yeah,
highly, highly recommend folks check out the security best practices because it outlines like when you host an MCP server, here's the risks you have to be aware of. And by the way,
yeah,
here's the recommendations that we recommend you do. They're very vendor agnostic. We're not trying to push you into any product or any specific implementations, but just like be aware that it's there,
yeah.
read through it, and then use the tools and the products that you need, your organization needs to mitigate those risks.
Yeah, for sure. And like, there's it's just interesting that like obviously security's always been an important thing and like
Mhm.
observability, but like obviously AI seems to be accelerating that because like I don't
Yeah.
know about the conversations you had at the AI World Fair, but like I, there was a bunch of folks who were just excited to build or just getting into it. So like security, they weren't really thinking about too much. It's just like, how do I
Yeah.
start building stuff? But then, there were people like there from some big orgs just saying, oh yeah, no, like security's top of mind, observability. And it's just, I'm curious if
Yeah.
you had similar conversations because I think one thing I'm kind of noticing, and again, this is just from what I've seen in the
Yeah.
community, but it seems like people are building, they're excited about it, obviously, and then it's like okay, we've got to put this to prod now,
Yeah,
and then it's
exactly.
like there's a gap there because like, I mean, I know you're obviously security minded, but you kind of need to start with security even at the beginning, you know what I mean? Because it's kind of like what I was saying before about my SharePoint experience. I'm running admin on my local machine and then it goes into prod and it's like, oh, no wonder that doesn't work because you're
Yeah,
not an admin. You know what I mean? So it's
yeah.
yeah, just curious if what you've kind of been seeing in the space.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely like a mixed bag of like how people care about security and where. Definitely, if you're talking to enterprises, big companies, the Fortune 500s, they all care about like this has to be secure by default. Like I do not want
Yeah.
this to be security as a tack on later on, because for obvious reasons they have a lot of confidential data and you don't want to expose it because
Yeah.
just because you ran an MCP server somewhere, which is be silly. So
Yeah.
it's a mixed bag, but then you also see kind of folks that are like, I'm running fast, I'm implementing this, I'm building the server, it does the thing, but now I
Mhm.
realize that, if I now have to handle it at scale of multiple users hitting up my endpoints, how do I make
Yeah.
sure that their data is not exposed? And this is where kind of the security conversation comes in very organically because
Yeah.
it's hard to do this. Now I see a question from Robert that actually kind of comes to what we're discussing, and this is
Yeah, exactly.
Robert's question is: I'm confused about requirements of MCP client server auth and how connects to MCP server auth with say the API that's in front of it. So for this is a kind of a misconception a little bit because people think that, let's say I'm building an MCP server for Gmail or I'm building an MCP
Yeah.
server for Dropbox, doesn't mean that I, the user, need to log in with Dropbox to access my MCP server. And that's
Mhm.
not quite true because
Yeah.
when you log in with it or when you authorize yourself with the MCP server, you actually have to get a token for that MCP server itself, right? You're not going to get a token for Dropbox and then pass it to your server and say, "Hey, use this Dropbox token to go get my files." Like that's a security boundary violation. Like you should not be doing. You should never be doing that. This is what's referred as token pass-through. That because your MCP server in this case has no way of validating that this token is correct, that this token was issued for it properly, that this token was not stolen. Like a myriad of things can go wrong if you do this. So do not
Yeah.
do token pass-through. You get a token for the server itself and then say, hey, I'm using whatever identity provider or authorization server. I get the token, I pass it to the server can validate, or in this case, we talk about gateways. The gateways can do this for you. You should totally use a
Yeah.
gateway if you can. And then when you are in talking to other downstream APIs, be it Gmail or Dropbox, Salesforce, whatever, what you need to do is do an out of band authorization flow. We actually have a proposal from folks from arcade.dev, Nate
Okay,
Barbacini,
yeah.
Austin, right? They were talking about like out of band elicitations for secure auth. And that's what it does. It's basically like once you connect to the server and say, okay, I then have access to the server. Now I want
Mhm.
to connect to Gmail. Now I want to connect to Salesforce. How do I do this? And then the server can provide me the link essentially to the client that says, hey, get the user to this URL. They'll authorize themselves. Then my
Mhm.
server is going to receive the token for Gmail or Salesforce, and then the
Yeah.
server will operate on those downstream APIs. But there's this kind of very clean cut separation here where first you need to authorize yourself to the server and make sure that
Yeah.
the server knows that you have access to it. And then the server will say, and by the way, also I need access to downstream APIs like Dropbox or whatever else. And then the server is going to guide the client to get the user to authorize. And then the server is going to get the tokens for those services, get the data, and then map out internally basically the tokens between like, oh, this is the Dropbox token for Den. This is Den
Yeah.
server token. These are associated together. Let's make sure that Den, whenever he invokes the tool get files, I will use this token to go talk to Dropbox. So that's
Yeah.
the pattern. But a lot of these like are see like when we start building this infrastructure out, a lot of these trends start emerging, a lot of these patterns start emerging where we're trying to guide folks to understand like how this actually works in practice, how this works in enterprises, because
Mhm.
a lot of these questions do pop up. And like you said, because for a lot of folks, security becomes like, oh yeah, I need to do that. How do I
Yeah.
do it? These topics pop up at that point.
Yeah. And I think maybe the confusion that like Robert was asking there too is, and like, and I get it. This gets back to what I was saying before about OAuth. It's like
Mhm.
you're logging in, but it's called OAuth, but like so like you're going
Yeah.
through your IDP, like you said, like you get to you say like I want to register this MCP server, and then that MCP server says, oh, this is my calendar service. I need to auth to Google, and then you see like if you're not logged in, like if you're logged in, it just says
Mhm.
authorize this. But if you're not logged in, you see you get redirected to Google. And I think that's maybe the confusion that it looks like you're giving them your login info, but you're not. It's that you're getting that token after you've gone through the IDP and stuff. And like it's
Yes.
it does I totally get why it looks confusing.
It does. It does. And this is like my job is like for the next however much time MCP is going to exist. My job is going to be to make this as easy as possible for people to grok, because
Yeah.
the goal here is I want people to build secure MCP servers by default without having to think much about it. That's the
Yeah.
dream. That is the end goal here, to make sure that when you build an MCP server, you don't need to worry about all these things. You don't need to worry about the fact that like, oh, am I like, what are token pass-through scenarios? Like, you don't need to care
Mm.
about that. Use the SDK. Here's the reference implementation. Here's the IDPs that we support. Here's the scenarios that you can use this in. Here's how to do this with server to server without user interaction, because that's actually another very important topic, right? Like we talk about OAuth as a user interaction thing, right? Like you
Mhm.
have to go to the browser, you have to go and log in and then get the token. But OAuth also covers a lot of scenarios that are not user interaction, things like server to
Yeah.
server. Like, what if there is no user in the loop? How does that work? And this is
Yeah.
where a lot of these things will kind of crop up, and we're working on it very, very, very actively.
Yeah, no, that's and I think that's the thing. I mean, obviously we have server to server already, like pre-agentic, but I think yeah, that's something that definitely needs to get tackled because like,
Mhm.
for now people have been like, oh, it's chat GPT, I've got an MCP server. But getting back to what I was saying about like if your MCP server also happens to
Oh
be
yeah,
an MCP client, and then it and it can get complicated, and this ties into the observability too, because like,
yeah,
just because you give access to your initial MCP server, what are the implications of that after it starts going to other MCP
yeah.
servers? Is it just saying, here's all the same, you know, you can do all the same things on that other server? Maybe you shouldn't.
Mhm.
Probably you shouldn't.
Yeah,
So like, it's just like a lot of stuff like that, and like I don't know. This is kind of like where we've been working in, like said, the gateway and stuff, and
yeah.
like there's service accounts too, but like we've been kind of focusing on, because like it's zero trust what we do, and it's all
Yeah.
open source what I'm talking about, by the way, for anybody listening. But it's like that's why we've been like, the fine grained policies. This has been working really well for us,
Mhm.
and one thing, like, I haven't seen too many people talking about this, but like you can obviously like secure an MCP server, but I haven't seen people really doing it at the tool level. It's either you get
Yeah.
the MCP server or
Mm.
you don't, and that's kind of what
Yeah.
like what we've been able to do right now. And I'm sure other people will probably do similar things, but it's really interesting because like from the security standpoint, like I can give you even though it's with our official Northwind sales database, but like I basically asked it to cook the books, like add like I don't know, increment the sales in a particular country by
Mhm.
1.24, and it goes to do the tool calls, and then the policy says that my user doesn't have access to update the database. So and this gets back to LLMs and context and stuff.
Yeah.
LLMs, they're not humans. They're just trying to help you do what you do, and it's
Yep.
just reading the text. Oh, it says Nick wants to increase the sales by 1.24. Let me
Mhm.
try. And the cool thing, at least like on the stuff I'm excited about that we've been working on, is like you literally cannot do that right now. Like if the policy says like I can't call that tool, then like I can't cook the books, and that doesn't cover everything. There's obviously
Yeah.
like prompt injection and all kinds of other things, but I don't know. It's been I don't know. I'm just excited working in this space. One, because there's a lot going on, and it's
Yeah.
just
There's a lot to be
honestly,
figured out. Like, right?
yeah.
Like a lot of the things that you're talking about, like you're talking about like primitive authorization. Like I have a proposal in the MCP repository that kind of
Okay.
talks about the exact same thing, but I think initially I was like, oh, this needs to be in the spec, but then you realize like the sheer volume of authorization, decision, and policies is just immense, and you're
Yeah,
not going to bake that into the spec. So this is probably going to be one of those like best practice guidelines. And this, what you
okay.
just described, is precisely is something that we need. Is
Mhm.
okay. I'm somebody that's a developer. I want to make sure that I have like an MCP server for my bank internally,
Yeah,
right? Which can be a scary thing if you think about it, but whatever.
yeah,
And you can say like, hey, this MCP server expose a tool called list transactions for user. I want to make
yeah,
sure that only people with specific permissions can invoke that tool. They can still access the MCP server because the MCP server can have like 100 different tools, but I
yeah,
only want very specific categories of users to be able to access those tools. How do I do
yeah,
this? And that's where we need those concrete guidelines. We need those reference limitations. We need those examples
yeah,
that you're just talking about with like the gateway that you're building. Is how do I do this? How do I actually limit? How
yeah,
do I establish the policies for those? How's that validated on the server side? Because again, I do not want developers building this from scratch, because
yeah.
people will get it wrong, and the cost of getting it wrong is high.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's 100% about the like just make it easy so that this is one of the problems with security. Like I remember this when I worked at McAfee. Security is inherently complex. People want secure things, but
Mhm.
they want it to be easy, and those things
Yeah,
are literally at odds.
trade-off, right? Like
Yeah,
it's that trade-off. It's like you want security, you want ease. Like which one of them do you want the most? Because like
yeah,
you know what the most secure MCP server is? It's the one that does not exist. It's the most secure.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
nobody will access it ever. But like we also live in the real world. We realize that like if you are building something for other users, you have to put it on the internet. You have to
Yeah,
expose it to the internet. But that means like what guardrails, what controls do you put around it to make sure that it's still secure but also usable? Because if you ask me to
yeah,
like, oh, before you can use this MCP server, you need to like generate a certificate and add it to your certificate store and then make sure your client support, like it's just absolutely bizarre. This like Rube
yeah,
Goldberg machine of security things you need to do. That's unreasonable. It would be
yeah.
secure, sure, but to what degree you're trading off usability. And this is where we think where we landed with the current specification is a good balance of usable while secure and encouraging good patterns.
Yeah, and it's still an educational thing too, I
Mhm.
think, as well, and but it's honestly like I don't know. I just feel pretty pumped being in the space right now. It just like
Yes,
with everything going on,
it's
it's
the
like
time.
yeah, and it's like if it doesn't seem like it happens that often when there's something like this happening in the space, like
Yeah,
obviously AI in general is exploding right now,
yeah.
but I don't know, it just feels exciting to be a part of something where it's still kind of really early days, like
Mhm.
we're what, 8 months in, what, November? Yeah, 8
Yeah,
months maybe,
less than a year.
So yeah,
Which
and
is
it's
the
wild.
before times. Like I said, November now is like
Yeah,
far,
yeah,
far back there. A
yeah.
lot of things have changed. This is where some folks things like, oh, like MCP stuff. Like we have all these specs. Like, can we just go and start publishing like detailed guides? Like your guide's gonna be out of date by the time you publish it. I guarantee it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly,
My
exactly.
blog posts are probably out of date by the time they're out. Like you should check out like what's the latest in the spec. Like don't just read my blog.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. And there's all like these are other things that they talked about at the MCP Dev Summit, but there's a lot of other exciting things I think for the ecosystem, like
Yeah.
your colleague Toby over at
Hmm.
GitHub with
Hmm.
they presented the MCP registry, and I think
Yeah.
this is super important because like right now, like I think people are trying to do goodwill by saying like here's my awesome MCP repos or here's another one, and then like
Yeah.
I remember some of the master people, they're like, there's so many registries. We made a registry of registries, and then
Yeah.
like,
It's an
which is
exhibit
funny.
meme. Like they,
Yeah,
the exhibit meme of like we put a car in your car because we
yeah,
heard you
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
cars. It's that for registries. But Toby's awesome. They actually have been driving a lot of this registry centralization work. So there will be one kind of central
yeah,
registry, and other experiences can build on top of it.
yeah. And I think it's super important. Just like you have npm or you've got NuGet or whatever.
Yep.
Shout out to NuGet. It's been a minute for me, but you need those things because like I think people will typically say like, oh, it's coming out of NuGet, it's coming out on PM. yes,
Yeah.
there's still like security issues that go on, but in general, you could probably trust what's in the registry there in in general.
Yeah.
So I think this is a good move forward, and this is uh, shout out to VS Code too. I'm a big fan of VS Code. I've been using it for like ever. It's like small tangent, but like I've been doing TypeScript since 2015, and I remember I was working at a Microsoft shop and they said we're using TypeScript, so we're like, okay. And originally I was like, why did JavaScript need types? But that's a whole other thing. And clearly I was wrong. But I remember using VS Code in the initial days. There was literally no extensions. It was literally a glorified Notepad for
Mhm.
TypeScript, and then it got better. Anyways, that little tangent is
Well,
because
thank you.
yeah.
The team is happy. Like the team is, man, I got the privilege of working with some of the folks building some of this MCP stuff, and they're
Mhm.
very keen on your feedback. They're very keen on seeing how folks adopt this because we're in the early days. A lot of things
Yeah.
change fast, and we don't claim to know all the answers, but this is where the community helps. So, yeah,
Yeah.
shout out to VS Code as well. I'll say it too.
Yeah, no, because the thing I noticed, I'm on Insiders. Also, pro
Yeah.
tip: if you use VS Code, use Insiders. It's very stable. But I noticed in a recent update of Insiders, like you have the MCP.json file
Hmm.
for your MCP servers, but now they kind of give a similar experience to VS Code extensions. So you get a
Hmm.
nice page for an MCP server, and
Yeah.
it's and this will probably tie into once we have a registry as well, I
Yeah.
imagine. So it's
For
just a
sure.
nice experience.
Yeah,
Oh,
and I think this is the part too. Like, there's also a security component to this. I just blogged about this, of course,
of
but
course.
the gist is like, right, like when you add a new server now, you as a developer, you as a user that uses VS
Yeah,
Code wants to see like, hey, I'm adding this new server here, is this the right one? Is this the one that I actually expect to see? And this is where it gives
yeah,
you that kind of command where you can see right on top of the kind of the view of saying, oh, you're about to run this Docker command with the following parameters because the server claims to be that this is what it's doing. Like there's of
yeah.
course a lot of dangers in running an arbitrary command. So this is that gate that
Mhm.
stops you from doing something silly where you can say, oh, I accidentally added this MCP server that just
Yeah,
RMRF my entire home directory. It's like,
yeah,
or worse, right? So this gives you that kind of initial gate. But you're right. Like once the registry comes in, a lot of these things become complementary, and you have this end-to-end experience of showcasing the metadata about the
mhm.
server, so you have the full context before you add it to your workflow. And we have a
Yeah, cool.
question. So, any
Yeah,
pointers to
it's
find
my
more on the
buddy
registry?
Roy here. Yeah,
Yeah, I'd say like I will shout out to Toby Padilla from GitHub that's been driving a lot of this work. I'd say like it's on GitHub. I believe if you go to Model Context Protocol /servers, and if not, you can hold me accountable and ping me directly on like Blue Sky or whatever else, and then I
yeah,
can connect you to the folks of the registry, and we can chat more, or LinkedIn because that works
yeah.
too.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a link to it right now. But anyways, Roy, I'll drop it in the comments after, or I'll post it in the YouTube notes or on LinkedIn as a comment. But great question, Roy. Yeah, Roy's doing a lot of cool stuff in the AI space. So thanks for the question. Cool. Yeah, we're close to time here. You know, want to be respectful of your time, obviously. We got a few minutes. I guess you're a big fan of Halo.
Oh man,
Uh,
yes, I am.
I think I've asked you this before, but like, how did you get into it? Like, I like video games. It's just I'm still like old school. Like, I love like just Super Mario, you know,
Yeah,
and like 2D stuff. And it's partially because I, not that I don't like newer games. It's just it's more of an investment, you know. Whereas I can just play the old games, and it's like I don't need 3 weeks to
yeah,
finish the thing or
yeah.
whatever. But like, I guess because I remember when you're at Netlify, you're always talking about Halo, and
Oh
I'm
man,
curious,
it's
like,
still the
it's
same.
obviously an awesome game, but like, I guess, how did you get so into it?
This is a good note to wrap up the podcast. Halo. I'll say like, look, man, like I grew up on it. And
Okay.
grew up is like a relative term. Like whenever the Halo, like the story was just so captivating to me when I first started that I was like, this is awesome. You know how people like Star Wars and Star Trek and
Yeah.
all these things? I've never seen any of them. So this is
Okay.
a random fact. I have never seen any of the Star Wars and Star Trek, but Halo is my Star Wars because after
Okay.
I played it once, I was like, this is freaking awesome. There's like space, there's aliens, there's a whole bunch of story behind this, and it's all about like the space horror kind of thing about the flood and whatnot. So I thought that it's kind of a cool concept, and boy, it just kind of stuck around. It just did like I
Yeah.
it's one of those things where the more you kind of grow up on it and you reflect on it and you realize like this is freaking cool. Like this, people collect Marvel comics. I
Yeah.
collect Halo stuff, and it just kind of stuck. I'll say like I'm a product of the environment at that point.
Yeah. Speaking of comics, I've been trying to sell mine, but I collected comics. I
Oh,
got
there
a
you go.
I,
Wow. You're like
I,
they're all like shrink wrapped and everything.
yeah. I got rid of like the more expensive ones because like honestly they don't have any sentimental value to me now, and they were literally
Yeah.
just taking up space. So I'm like, might as well cash out. But like,
Yeah.
uh, but I just I love and video games are good at this too. But I just love how like growing up seeing like like I loved Wolverine and Spider-Man
Hmm.
and there was bad movies in the 90s where it's like, Spider-Man's like in pajamas basically kind of,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and like even though people might have like Marvel or DC overdosing of movies, I still love watching all of them because even though I obviously know it's not real, it's so amazing that they look so much like the comic, like for real, like I know it's
Yeah.
clearly not Hulk, but in real life, but it's just like the CGI, if it's done well, it's just really cool to watch. So like I never really get sick of those movies, and it's just
Yeah.
just cool
Yeah.
stuff, man.
I'll say it too, man. It's like it's a massive shout out to folks at Halo Studios because like they have kind of indirectly encouraged my fandom of the franchise, but like the folks are awesome, the events are great. Like I've had interactions with the engineers, and that kind of that reinforces the loop of just like it's freaking great. It's a good community to be a part of. Like, see, I'm sporting like the HCS, like right, Halo World Championship,
Okay.
man. Like you knew it when I jumped on this call that Halo's gonna make it somehow.
Yeah. For folks in the chat, I did not know he was wearing that T-shirt, but that's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. There you go.
Dedication, people. I
Dedication.
think that's a great place to wrap up. Dan, I dropped the link to your blog post again that people can to your blog, sorry, that people can check out, and definitely encourage you to give a read over there. Go give Dan a follow on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. I'm a big fan of Blue Sky too. Still on X because it's just
Yeah.
makes sense for work and stuff, but I've been enjoying Blue Sky a lot. But anyways, thanks so much for taking time today. I love just hanging, and I'll ask you one last question before we go. Are you going to be heading to the MCP Dev Summit in London?
It's up in the air. The jury's still out.
Okay. Yeah, I just found out I'll be heading there, so I'm excited to go.
That's
Just
exciting.
interact with the community again, and might be giving a talk. We'll see. But yeah, if you make it there, it'd be great to hang again. And yeah, just want to give
Thank
a
you for
shout out
having
to
me,
everybody in
Nick.
the chat. Oh yeah, no problem, man. And thanks everybody for the great questions. And we'll see you in the next one. And yeah, Dan, if you don't mind, just stay on for 1 second. And everybody else,